In the summer of 1987, every farmer in Chickasaw County, Iowa, grew corn. This was not a decision. It was geography. It was identity. It was the kind of fact that sits so deep in a community that nobody thinks to question it, the way nobody questions which direction the river runs, or whether the sky is above or below them. Corn was what the soil wanted, what the elevators bought, what the banks understood, and what the neighbors respected. You grew corn in Chickasaw County, the way you breathed in Chickasaw County, without deliberation, without ceremony, and without the slightest suspicion that there might be another way. Let me tell you about the Lindgren farm because you need to understand the place before you can understand the people who worked it. The farm sat on 680 acres of northeastern Iowa bottomland, straddling a wide crook in the Little Turkey River about 9 miles southwest of New Hampton. Harlan Lindgren had farmed it since 1961, the year he came back from 2 years in the Army with a bad left knee, a quiet disposition, and a certainty about corn that bordered on religious conviction. His father, Gunnar, had farmed it before him, and Gunnar's father, Eric, had broken the original ground in 1903, hauling limestone out of the ravines by hand and stacking it into the fence rows that still mark the property lines in 1987. 3 generations of Lindgrens had looked out at those 680 acres and seen the same thing: corn in the spring, corn in the summer, corn in the fall, and frozen black ground in the winter waiting to grow corn again. Harlan was 54 years old in 1987, a careful man with large hands and a habit of looking at the sky before he said anything important. He ran his operation the way his father had taught him, methodical, unhurried, never in debt. He couldn't service, never in a hurry. He couldn't explain. He planted DeKalb 689 hybrid seed at 32,000 seeds per acre and 28% nitrogen in the spring, and ran a 4-row John Deere 4440 with a cab he'd added in 1979 because his wife Sylvia told him she wasn't going to watch him get heat stroke for the sake of tradition. His yields averaged 147 bushels per acre on his best ground, and 118 on the low ground near the river. At one point, $85 per bushel. That made him a careful, consistent, modestly profitable farmer in a county full of careful, consistent, modestly profitable. He wanted to be reliable, and in Chickasaw County in 1987, reliable meant corn. Now let me tell you about the bog, because the bog is the reason this story exists. On the far western edge of the Lindgren property, where the ground dropped away from the upland fields and flattened out into a wide, wet depression, maybe 40 acres across, there was a piece of ground that had never grown corn and never would. The locals called it Lindgren's Bog, and they had called it that for as long as anyone could remember. It was a low, wet, cattail-choked mess of standing water, sedge grass, and black muck that stayed saturated from March through July, in most years, and never fully dried out. Even in August, Harlan's grandfather, Eric, had tried to tile drain it in 1921, laying clay tile by hand across the entire depression, at a cost that nearly broke him, and the tile had done almost nothing. The water table in that part of the county sat too high, the underlying clay layer too impermeable, and the depression too wide and too flat to drain by gravity alone. Eric had given up. Gunnar had given up. The bog was not farmland. The bog was a fact like the limestone in the fence rows and the direction of the river, and you did not argue with facts. Every spring Harlan would walk the edge of that bog and look at 40 acres of ground he could not use, and he would do a quiet calculation in his head. 40 acres at 130 bushels, average at $1.85 a bushel, and he would arrive at a number somewhere around $9,600 a year that he was not making. And then he would walk back to the tractor and plant corn in the fields he could reach, and not think about the bog again until the following spring. It felt like weather. Let me tell you about Greta Lindgren, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from almost every character you will hear about on this channel. Not because she was smarter than her father, though she was, and not because she worked harder, though she did, but because she had spent 4 years at Iowa State University reading things that nobody in Chickasaw County had read, and she had come home in May of 1987 with a degree in agricultural science. A worn canvas notebook full of handwritten tables and soil test data, and a single idea that she could not get out of her head. She was 22 years old. She weighed maybe 115 pounds. She wore her mother's old Carhartt jacket 2 sizes too large, and she had her grandfather Gunnar's habit of looking at the ground when she was thinking, which was most of the time. Let me tell you about what Greta had learned at Iowa State, because the science is the foundation of everything that follows. And if you don't understand the science, you won't understand why what she proposed was not crazy. It was, in fact, the opposite of crazy her advisor, a soil scientist named Dr. Penn. Annalise Borgman had spent 15 years studying what she called alternative, high-value wetland agriculture, the deliberate cultivation of crops that did not merely tire them. The research had been building quietly in the agricultural literature since the late 1972s, drawing on production models, and what it showed was this: certain crops, grown in wet bottomland conditions that made conventional grain farming impossible, could generate per acre rain farming and dwarfed corn. Not by a little. By a factor of 3 to 5, the crop Greta had become obsessed with was wild rice. Not the paddy-grown cultivated wild rice that food companies were starting to market in 1987, but true Zizania palustris, the aquatic grass that had grown in the lakes and river margins of the upper mist for thousands of years and was beginning to attract serious commercial interest as a specialty food ingredient. Dr. Boardman's field trials in Otter Tail County, Minnesota, had run for 6 consecutive years. The data was in the notebook Greta carried home on the Greyhound bus from Ames. Average yield in established stands, 480 to 620 pounds of clean grain per acre. Average commercial price in 1986 and 1987, $2.4 to $3.1 per pound. Average grown $150 to $1,920. Against corn's $240 to $270 per acre, gross, at prevailing prices. The comparison was not subtle. Greta had run the numbers for the bog so many times she could do them in her head. 40 acres at even the low end of the range, 480 pounds per acre at $2.4 was $46,080 in gross revenue from ground that was currently generating nothing. From 40 acres of ground that her grandfather had written off in 1921, she had also read everything she could find about the practical requirements. Wild rice needed standing water between 6 inches and 2 feet deep during the growing season. Slightly acidic soil with good organic content, and protection from wave action during germination. Lindgren's bog had standing water averaging 14 inches in a wet spring, soil pH of 5.8 to 6.2 across most of the Depression. She had pulled cores her FEF the previous summer during a visit home, and the surrounding cattail stands provided natural wind protection all. The bog was not a problem to be solved. The bog was, if you knew what to look for, exactly what you needed. The kitchen table conversation happened on a Wednesday evening in late May, after the supper dishes had been cleared and Harlan had poured himself a second cup of coffee. Greta had been home 3 weeks. She had spent those 3 weeks walking every inch of the bog, pulling additional soil cores, measuring water depths with a marked stake she drove into the muck at 6 points across the Depression, and filling in the tables in her notebook with numbers that grew more compelling. She had also spent those 3 weeks trying to find the right moment to say what she needed to say to her father, and she had concluded that there was no right moment, so she sat down across from him at the table with the notebook open and the Minnesota data on top. And she said, Harlan looked at her over his coffee cup. He set the cup down. He looked at the notebook. He said, "What about it?" Greta talked for 45 minutes. She went through the soil data, the water depth measurements, the Minnesota yield trials, the price history, the revenue projections. She explained wild rice biology, the germination requirements, the water management. She explained what it would take to convert the bog. Minimal earthwork to create a low berm along the one open side. A simple water control structure to regulate depth during critical growth stages. Seed sourcing from a Minnesota supplier. Boardman had connected her with. She had estimated the conversion cost at between $8,000 and $12,000 for the first year, including seed, earthwork, and equipment modification. She had run a 5-year projection showing cumulative net revenue of over $200,000 from ground that was currently generating. Harlan listened to all of it without interrupting. He looked at the notebook. He looked at his coffee. He looked out the window at the dark where the fields were. He said, "That's a lot of money to spend on a bog." "It's a lot of money to leave in a bog," Greta said. Harlan picked up the notebook and looked at the Minnesota yield table for a long time. Sylvia, who had been washing the last pot at the sink and pretending not to listen, set the pot down quietly on the drying rack and said without turning around, "She's right, you know." Harlan looked at his wife's back. He looked at his daughter. He set the notebook down and said, "I need to think about it." He thought about it for 2 weeks. Then he came to Greta one morning while she was pulling weeds in the kitchen garden and said, "I'll give you the 40 acres, but I'm not spending $12,000 on an experiment. If you can do it for $6,000, you can try it." Greta looked up at him. She said, "I can do it for $6,000. He nodded and walked back toward the machine shed, and that was the agreement, and it was the most important conversation that had happened on the Lindgren farm in 3 generations. Let me tell you about Buck Sievert because you need to understand him before you can understand what he said to Greta Lindgren at the Chickasaw County Co-op in June of 1987, and what that said cost him over the following decade. Buck Sievert was 61 years old and had been the dominant figure at the New Hampton Farmers Co-op for going on 22 years. He was a big man, heavy-set, with a white seed cap he wore indoors and out, and a voice that carried across a room without him trying. He had grown up on a corn farm 2 townships over, had worked his way into the co-op manager position in 1965, and had built the operation into the largest grain marketing outlet in the county. He knew every farm family in Chickasaw County by name, knew their acreage and their yield history and their debt load and their seed preference, and he had strong opinions about all of it. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 22 years being right about corn. and that kind of record builds a particular kind of certainty that is very hard to argue with, and very hard to see past. Greta came into the co-op on a Tuesday morning in mid-June to pick up a soil amendment order her father had placed, and Buck was behind the counter holding court with 3 other farmers the way he did most mornings, coffee in hand. He looked up when she came in and said, "Morning, Greta. Here, you're home from college." "She said she was," he said. "Harlan tells me you've got some kind of project going out on that wet ground." The 3 farmers at the counter turned to look at her. She said she was converting the bog to wild rice production. She said it the same way she might say she was planting soybeans, plainly, without apology, because she had spent 2 weeks preparing for this conversation, and she was not going to be made to feel embarrassed about data. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Buck Sievert started laughing. It was not a mean laugh, exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has heard something so far outside his experience. It was the laugh of a man who has been right for 22 years and has learned to treat unfamiliar ideas as entertainment. He said, "Wild rice in Chickasaw County." He said it the way you might say, "palm trees in Alaska." The 3 farmers at the counter smiled. One of them shook his head slowly. Buck said, "Honey wild rice grows in Minnesota. This is Iowa. You want to know what grows in Iowa?" He gestured broadly at the window and the county beyond it. "Corn grows in Iowa." Greta set her hands flat on the counter. She said, "The soil pH in the bog runs 5.8 to 6.2. The water depth averages 1-4 inches in the growing season. The Minnesota trials ran 6 years and averaged 480 to 620 pounds per acre at $2.4 to $2.3. So the comparison isn't wild rice versus corn. It's wild rice versus nothing." She paused. "I'd be happy to show you the data if you'd like to see it." Buck Sievert looked at her for a moment. His smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. He said, "I'd hate to see Harlan waste good money on a college experiment." He said it gently, which was almost worse than if he'd said it harshly, because the gentleness implied that the experiment's failure was so certain it didn't even merit argument. He said, "You go ahead and try it if you want. But when it doesn't work, don't come crying to me about it." The 3 farmers at the counter had stopped smiling. They were watching Greta the way people watch a young animal that has wandered somewhere it shouldn't be. Greta picked up her soil amendment order. She said, "I'll see you at harvest." She walked out on the drive home. She did not cry, which was something she would remember later. She was angry, but the anger was clean and useful. The kind of anger that organizes itself into work rather than dissolving into self-pity. By the time she pulled into the Lindgren driveway, she had already decided that she would not go back to the co-op until she had numbers that Buck Sievert could not laugh at. She spent the rest of June building the water control structure. The earthwork was simpler than she had projected. The bog's natural topography required only a 180-foot berm along the northwest corner, where the depression had its one low outflow point, and a neighbor with a small dozer. The water control structure itself was a modified stop-log design she had drawn from a Minnesota D.R. wetland management manual, built from treated lumber and galvanized hardware, at a materials cost of $340. She seeded in late June, broadcasting 38 pounds of scarified wild rice seed per acre from a canoe she paddled in a systematic grid across the flooded depression. Working from the notebook's planting map she had drawn the previous winter. Total first-year investment came to $5,840, inside the $6,000 limit her father had set. Then she waited Wild rice does not reward impatience. The seed germinates underwater, sending up a floating leaf stage called the floating leaf that drifts on the surface for 3 to 4 weeks before the plant anchors and sends up the aerial stem. During that period, the stand looks like nothing. A few pale green ribbons, floating on brown water, so sparse and tentative that a person who didn't know what they were looking at would conclude the whole thing had failed. Harlan walked out to the bog with Greta twice during July, and both times he looked at the water and the thin floating leaves and said nothing, which was not the same as approval, but was not disapproval either. He was reserving judgment the way careful men do, letting the evidence accumulate before he committed to a position. Buck Sievert drove past the Lindgren farm on County Road B 47 3 times that summer, which Greta knew because the road ran along the north edge of the property, and you could see the bog from it, and each time she was working near the road, she saw his truck slow down. She did not wave. He did not stop. By the second week of August, the stand had come in. Not everywhere. There were gaps in the northwest quadrant, where the water depth had run too shallow during a dry spell in July, and a section along the east edge where the cattail competition had been heavier, but across roughly 28 of the 40 acres, the wild rice was standing 4 to 5 feet tall, dense and green gold in the late summer light, the heavy seed heads beginning to nod as the grain filled. It was, by any measure, a crop. It looked different from corn, wilder, looser, more like something that had grown there on its own than something that had been planted, but it was unmistakably a crop, and Greta stood at the edge of the bog on an August even at the edgew, mog. Else was certain you were wrong about. The harvest was difficult. Wild rice does not combine like corn. The traditional method used in Minnesota was a pair of canoes with flailing sticks, knocking the ripe grain into the hull as you moved through the stand. But for 28 productive acres, that was impractical. Greta had spent part of her spring researching mechanical harvest options and had located a used wild rice harvester, a modified aquatic harvester built on a pontoon frame, with a reel and auger headed producer was selling for $3,200. She had bought it in July with money she had saved working summers during college, without telling her father, and had it trucked down to the farm and stored in the back of the machine shed under a tarp. Harlan had found it in late July and had come to her with a look on his face that she had learned to read as the expression between concern and respect. He had looked at the machine for a long time and said, "Does it work?" She said she had tested the drive system and replaced 2 belts, and she believed it would work. He nodded and said, "All right." That was the second most important conversation on the Lindgren farm that year. The harvest ran 4 days in mid-September, Greta operating the harvester from the bow platform, while her younger brother Nils ran the receiving boat alongside. The grain came in, wet, and required 2 passes through a profane dryer they rigged from equipment borrowed from a neighbor's grain setup. And the cleaning and drying added 2 more days of work after the field harvest was done. But when it was finished and the last bags were weighed and tallied, Greta sat down at the kitchen table with her notebook and wrote the number at the top of a clean page. 1,1,340 pounds of cleaned wild rice. From 28 productive acres. Kwiet blind bray joju han preek. Bray as might. That was 405 pounds per acre, below the Minnesota trial average, as she had expected for a first-year stand on new ground, but the price she had negotiated in August with a specialty food distributor out of Minneapolis. The gross revenue was $31,185. She set the notebook down on the table in front of her father. He looked at the number. For a long time. He said, "That's from the bog." He looked at it again. He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. He said, "What did you spend?" She showed him the full cost breakdown, $5,840. For the first year conversion, $3,200 for the harvesting costs. Total first year investment, $9,520. Net revenue, year 1, $21,665 from 40 acres of ground that had generated $0 in every prior year. Outside, the corn dryer was running on the main bins, a sound so constant and familiar that nobody in the Lindgren house consciously heard it anymore. Harlan looked at the notebook. He looked at his daughter. He said, "You spent $3,200 of your own money on that harvester." She said she had. He said, "I'll pay you back." She said, "You don't have to." He said, "I know I don't have to." He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the dark where the fields were. After a while he said, "Next year let's see if we can get all 40 acres producing." By the following spring, word had gotten around. In a county of 200 farm families, news travels the way water travels, finding every low point and filling it, and you cannot stop it, and there is no point in trying. The Lindgren Bog story had moved through the co-op counter conversations and the church parking lots, and the grain elevator waiting rooms over the winter, and by March of 1988, Greta was aware that people were talking about what she had done as clear as respect. It was more like a kind of watchful uncertainty, the community holding its verdict in reserve, waiting to see if the first year had been luck. Let me tell you about the 1988 growing season because it was the year that settled the question, and it settled it in a way that nobody in Chickasaw County had anticipated, including Greta. The summer of 1988 was the worst drought in the upper Midwest since 1936. It came on fast in late May and was merciless by July. The corn across Chickasaw County went into heat stress in the first week of July. Pollination was poor, the ears were short and light. The grain filled thin. By August, it was clear that the county was looking at a catastrophic yield year, and by harvest the numbers confirmed it. The county average dropped to 68 bushels per acre, less than half the normal yield. Farmers who had been averaging 140 to 150 bushels were cutting 60 to 70. At $2.1 per bushel, prices had risen somewhat in response to the national shortage, but not nearly enough. The gross revenue on a typical 160-acre corn farm had fallen from around $45,000 to roughly $22,000. Operating costs had not fallen. The drought had not been kind to operating costs. The Lindgren corn was the same. Harlan's best ground came in at 71 bushels, his worst at 52. It was a hard year on the corn side of the farm, and Harlan absorbed it the way he absorbed most hard things, without dramatics, with a careful look at the numbers, and with the quiet recalibration of a man who has been farming long enough to know that bad years come. But the bog was not corn. Wild rice is an aquatic plant. It does not experience drought the way upland crops do. The water in Lindgren's bog was maintained by Greta's water control structure at a consistent 12 to 16 inches throughout the growing season, drawing on the natural water table and the seasonal inflow from the low ground surrounding the depression. In the drought summer of 1988, the water table dropped enough that Greta had to close the outflow structure completely in July to maintain minimum depth, and there were 2 weeks in August when she was watching the water level with a daily anxiety that she would later describe as the most stressful 2 weeks of her farming life. But the stand held. The water never dropped below 9 inches at the shallowest point. The rice continued to fill. The 1988 harvest was Greta's second year on the bog, and the stand had matured. Second-year wild rice stands produce significantly higher yields than first-year plantings as the root systems establish, and the plant population fills in the gaps from the initial seeding. The 40 acres were now fully productive. The northwest quadrant that had been sparse in 1987 had filled in through natural reseeding over the winter, and the east edge competition from cattails had been managed by a targeted water drawdown in early spring. The harvest ran 5 days. When the final weights were in and the notebook was updated, the number at the top of the new page was 23,800 pounds of cleaned wild rice from 38.5 productive acres. That was 618 pounds per acre. Above the top of the Minnesota trial range, the price had moved to $3.15 per pound, as the 1988 drought tightened national specialty grain supplies. Greta wrote that number in the notebook and underlined it twice. The corn side of the Lindgren farm grossed $52,400 in 1988 on 440 acres of productive ground, against operating costs of roughly $38,000. The bog grossed $74,970 on 40 acres, against operating costs of roughly $6,200 for seed replenishment, fuel drying, and processing. The bog, which was 8.5% of the farm's total acreage, had generated more gross revenue than the other 91.5% combined. In the worst drought year in 52 years, the piece of ground that everyone in Chickasaw County had written off as worthless had not merely survived. It had carried the farm. Harlan looked at the numbers for a long time that fall evening. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he doesn't quite have the words for yet, he said. You were right. He said it simply, without qualification, which was not a thing Harlan Lindgren said easily or often. Greta did not say anything. She did not need to. He reached across the table and put his large hand over hers for a moment, and then he picked up the notebook and looked at the numbers again, and then he said, You decide the rotation from now on. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When Buck Sievert came to the Lindgren farm in October of 1988, he did not call ahead. He drove down the county road on a Tuesday afternoon and turned into the Lindgren driveway and knocked on the back door, which is the door that means business in Chickasaw County. Greta answered it. He was standing on the step with his white seed cap in his hands, which was something she had never seen before. Buck Sievert always wore his cap, indoors and out, and holding it in his hands was a gesture she recognized immediately as the rural Midwest equivalent. He looked older than she remembered from the co-op counter. He said, I was wondering if I could talk to you about that wild rice operation. Greta looked at him for a moment. She said, Come in. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down across from him. He sat down and turned the cap in his hands and said, I've got 3 families I work with who are in real trouble after this year. The drought hit them hard. They've got low ground, they can't drain, and they've been writing it off for years. He paused. I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk to them about what you did. Greta said, I seem to recall you telling me that wild rice grows in Minnesota and corn grows in Iowa. Buck Sievert looked at the table. He said, I remember, she said. I also recall you saying you'd hate to see my father waste good money on a college experiment, he said. I remember that, too. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I was wrong. Greta picked up her coffee cup. She looked at the man across the table, 61 years old, 22 years of certainty, and a drought year that had shaken something loose in him that probably needed shaking loose. The anger had burned off over 2 years of work and data and early mornings on the bog, and what was left was something quieter and more useful. She said, "The lesson isn't that wild rice is better than corn. Corn is the right crop for most of this county's ground, and I'd never tell anyone different. The lesson is that any farm that grows only one thing is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail. The bog didn't save us because wild rice is magic. It saved us because it was different. Because when the drought came for the corn, it couldn't come for the water." She set her cup down. "I'll talk to your 3 families. Bring them out next week." He nodded. He put his cap back on. He stood up and said, "Thank you." He walked to the back door and opened it, and then, "Stop, Father would have been proud of you." It was a thing she had not expected him to say, and she did not have an immediate answer for it, and by the time she had thought of one, his truck was already backing out of the driveway. Let me tell you about what happened over the following years, because the story doesn't end in October of 1988. It doesn't end there by a long way. The 3 families Buck Sievert brought to the Lindgren farm that November, the Olafussens from Fredericksburg Township, the Kowalski-Oppel named Rasmussen, who had taken over a river bottom farm from the wife's parents the previous year, all had wet ground that had been written off for years. Greta walked each of their properties, pulled soil cores, measured water depths, and wrote up conversion recommendations that she gave them for nothing, because she had not yet thought of herself as a consultant, only as a farmer who had figured something out and saw no reason not to share it. The Olisons converted 28 acres in 1989. The Kowalski family converted 35. The Rasmussens, who had 60 acres of river bottom depression that was entirely unproductive, converted all of it in 2 phases over 1989 and 1990. By 1992, there were 11 wild rice operations in Chickasaw County, all of them on ground that had previously generated no income, all of them seeded from stock that traced back to the Minnesota supplier docked. Boardman had connected Greta with in 1987. The county's collective wild rice acreage was 340 acres. The specialty food market had grown with the supply. Greta had spent 2 years building a direct relationship with 3 Minneapolis distributors, and by 1991, she was coordinating sales for all 11 operations through a loose in 4 Core Taney 91. She was coordinating sales for all 11 operations through a Luke. The average price had stabilized at $2.85 to $3.2 per pound. The collective revenue from those 340 acres in 1992 was a little over $290,000. Buck Sievert had stopped predicting failure somewhere around 1990. By 1991, he was quietly directing farmers with wet ground to call Greta Lindgren, which he did without fanfare or acknowledgement that this represented a change in his position, and which Greta accepted without comment, because she had decided that the goal was not to be right in public, but to have the right thing happen. In the spring of 1993, the Iowa State University Extension Service asked Greta to present her operations results at a regional agricultural conference in Waterloo. She drove to Waterloo on a Thursday morning in April in her father's truck, wearing the same Carhartt jacket she had worn home from college 6 years earlier, now faded and stained with bog, mud, and machine oil extension agents, Farm Bureau representatives, and agricultural lenders, and she talked for 45 minutes about soil, chemistry, water management, revenue per acre, and risk diversification. She did not editorize or dramatize. She let the data speak because the data by 1993 was speaking very loudly on its own. When she was finished, a man in the third row raised his hand and asked her how old she had been when she started the project. She said 22. He said, "And you were just out of college?" She said she was, he said. "And nobody in your county was doing this before you." She said nobody in her county had considered it, he said. "Why not?" She thought about that for a moment. She said, "Because everyone was growing corn, and when everyone is growing the same thing, it becomes very hard to imagine growing anything different. Not because the different thing won't work, because the familiar thing is so familiar that the unfamiliar thing looks wrong even when the numbers say it's right." She paused. The bog didn't look like farmland. It looked like a problem. It took someone who hadn't spent 30 years looking at it as a problem to see that it might be something else. Harlan Lindgren was sitting in the fourth row. He had driven to Waterloo without telling Greta, and she had not known he was there until she was halfway through her presentation and caught a glimpse of him in the audience, her father in his good flannel shirt, sitting very still with his large hands on his knees, watching her the way he watched the sky, before he said something important. When she finished and the room applauded, he stood up. He was not a man who stood for applause. He stood because it was his daughter, and because he had been wrong in 1987 and right by 1988, and he understood the difference between those two things. She saw him stand and looked at him for a moment from the podium. He nodded once, she nodded back. Let me tell you about what happened to the Lindgren farm in the decade that followed, because the numbers tell a story that deserves to be told plainly. Between 1987 and 1997, the bog generated cumulative gross revenue from 40 acres of ground that had generated $0 in the 84 years prior. The operating costs over that decade averaged $7,200 per year. The net revenue from the bog over 10 years was approximately $415,000. Harlan used a portion of that money to pay off the last of the farm's operating debt in 1991, 4 years ahead of schedule. He used another portion to replace the aging 4,440 with a new tractor in 1993. He put the rest in a certificate of deposit at the New Hampton Bank, and left it there the way careful men do with money they did not expect to have. The corn operation continued. Harlan never stopped growing corn, and Greta never suggested he should. Corn was right for 640 of the farm's 680 acres, and the discipline and consistency her father had built over 30 years was real and valuable, and not something to be discarded because one wet corner had found a better use. What changed was the farm's relationship to risk before the bog. A bad corn year was a crisis. After the bog, a bad corn year was a bad corn year, which is a different thing entirely. The farm had diversified not because diversification was fashionable, but because the ground itself had demanded it, and a 22-year-old with a notebook had been paying attention when everyone else was looking the other way. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has one more turn in it, and it is the turn that tells you whether a lesson was truly learned or only temporarily absorbed. In the spring of 1999, Greta's daughter, her name was Marin. She was 9 years old, and she had spent her entire conscious life watching her mother walk the bog with a measuring stick and a notebook. Came home from school with a library book about hemp cultivation. Not marijuana, industrial hemp, the fiber and seed crop that had been federally prohibited since 1937 and was beginning to be legalized in Canada and discussed seriously. Maren had found the book in the New Hampton Public Library, which surprised Greta because she hadn't known the New Hampton Public Library had a book about hemp, and she had read it cover to cover on the school bus. And she came home and sat down at the kitchen table across from her mother. Greta looked at her daughter. She looked at the library book. She thought about a Wednesday evening in May of 1987, and a notebook full of tables, and a man looking out a window at the dark where the fields were. She thought about the co-op counter and the laugh that had gotten smaller. She thought about 40 acres of bog that everyone had written off for 84 years. She said, "Tell me what you're thinking." Maren opened the book to a page she had dog-eared and set it on the table. She said, "Hemp seed oil is selling for $14 a pound in Canada. The fiber market is growing. The upland ground near the east fence row has that clay hardpan layer that's been limiting your corn yields to 110 bushels for 30 years. Hemp has a taproot that breaks hardpan. If you grew hemp in rotation on those 80 acres for 3 years, you'd break the hardpan and improve the corn yields on the rest of the rotation, and you'd generate hemp revenue in the meantime." She was 9 years old, and she had her great-grandfather Gunnar's habit of looking at the ground when she was thinking. She said, "The numbers work. I did them." Greta looked at her daughter for a long time. She looked out the window at the east fence row where the clay hardpan ground had been limiting her yields for as long as she could remember. She thought about what it had felt like to sit across a kitchen table from a man who loved her and needed to be convinced of something that the data had already settled. She thought about what it had felt like to stand at a co-op counter while a man laughed at her numbers. She thought about the bog and the water, and the 23,800 pounds of clean rice in the worst drought year in 52 years, and the way her father had stood up in a conference room, and Waterloo in 1993 been the person receivings can only be closed in one direction. She said, "Show me the numbers." Maren slid a piece of notebook paper across the table. The numbers were written in pencil in a 9-year-old's careful hand. Yield estimates, price projections, rotation schedules, a rough cost analysis that had some errors in it but was more right than wrong, which was all you needed to be at the beginning of something. Greta looked at the numbers for a long time. She looked at her daughter. She said, "This is good thinking," Maren said. "Does that mean yes?" Greta said, "It means yes." Greta still farms the Lindgren ground. The water control structure has been rebuilt twice since 1987, and the harvester has had 3 engine overhauls, and the notebook, the original canvas-covered notebook, she carried home from Iowa State on the Greyhound bus. Its pages stiff with age and the dried residue of bog water from a dozen mornings when she carried it in the field without thinking about what the water would do to the paper. She doesn't need the notebook anymore. She knows the numbers, the way her father knew the corn, without deliberation, without ceremony. But she keeps it there because some things are worth keeping, even after you no longer need them, and because her daughter knows the story of where it came from, and because someday Maren's daughter will sit at that table and open a notebook of her own and say, and the answer will be yes before the question is finished, because that is what the bog taught the Lindgrens, and what the Lindgrens have not forgotten. Greta planted wild rice in a corn county. The corn died, the rice lived, and the farm that everyone said was half worthless turned out to be worth more than anyone had imagined. Once, someone young enough not to know it was impossible. sat down and did the math,